We bid you welcome. We do not ask what you believe or expect you to think a certain way, but only that you try to live a kindly, helpful life with the dignity proper to a human being. Welcome all who believe that religion is wider than any sect and deeper than any set of opinions. Welcome all who might find in our friendship strength and encouragement for daily living. Good morning, and welcome to the Universalist Unitarian Church of Farmington. My name is Ellen Greenya, and I am part of the Building and Grounds Committee, chair. I'd like to extend a special welcome to any visitors today. After service, you are welcome to socialize at the back of the meeting house. When indoors, we are observing COVID precautions and wearing masks regardless of vaccination status. Religious education classes are being held in the social hall during the service. An usher can direct you to that location if needed. Due to COVID precautions, we ask that if you have a joy or a sorrow you'd like to share, please fill out a blue card and give it to an usher, and it will be read later in the service. You can also text me. My number is in the order of service. Please include your name in the text in case I don't recognize your number, and I probably won't. As we begin our service, we remember that our UU principles begin with our pledge to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of all people. We are a welcoming congregation. We welcome into our community people of all races, sexual orientations, gender identities, and belief systems. Please share our affirmation of mission together. We seek answers everywhere, include everyone, and live with compassion. Please rise as you are willing and able for our first hymn, number 116, I'm on My Way. This is an African-American call and response. I'm going to lead the call, and you can sing along with the response with Linda and Bev. I'm on my way to the freedom land. I'm on my way to the freedom land. I'm on my way to the freedom land. I'm on my way, great God, I'm on my way. Before Reverend Glenn comes up, I'm terribly sorry. I skipped over an announcement. I was so excited to sing that song with you. Sorry, George. The UUCF Daytimers group will not be meeting this month due to concerns over the recent high rate of COVID cases. We expect to meet again in February.
Our first reading this morning is an excerpt from a sermon Martin Luther King Jr. gave at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And he delivered it March 31st, 1968. It's entitled, "Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution." And it was only 5 days before he was assassinated in Memphis. In that sermon, he spoke, "No individual can live alone. No nation can live alone. Anyone who feels he can live alone is sleeping through a revolution. The world in which we live is geographically one. The challenge we face today is to make it one in terms of a sisterhood and brotherhood. We must all learn to live together as sisters and brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. We are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the way God's universe is made. This is the way it is structured." A core religious or spiritual value is unity and connectedness to all life. Connectedness or interconnectedness to humanity. Connectedness to the universe. This is poignantly reflected in our reading this morning when King says we are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. To me, it is reminiscent of the seventh principle of Unitarian Universalism, which states respect for the interdependent web of existence, of which we are a part. Connectedness includes connecting to people we like and people we may not like. Today, in the 21st century, it seems everybody loves Martin Luther King Jr. A decade ago, my unfortunate first namesake, Glenn Beck, paraded around Martin Luther King's niece at a march, ostensibly implying whatever he was for was in line with the MLK legacy. This is the same guy who warned Americans not to go to churches where they preach social justice. And later, Dinesh D'Souza had repeatedly attempts to use King for his arguments against affirmative action, blatantly falsely claiming that King was against affirmative action programs. It seems every city in America has a Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. In my lifetime, I was born in 1977, 9 years after King was assassinated. I grew up in middle-class white suburbs of Washington, D.C., and attended public school. I always expected to celebrate Martin Luther King Day in mid-January in my lifetime. I remember there were some controversies about it in Arizona in the late 80s when the governor tried to get rid of it as a state holiday. But many of you lived through the time of Martin Luther King Jr. It's interesting for me to reflect on what I was told about King growing up and what I know now. I was told King was a moderate, that Malcolm X and the Black Muslims and later the Black Panthers were more militarized or had a by any means necessary attitude, and MLK was nonviolent. I was usually led to believe that racism was an issue only in the South, not in the North and the West. And I was also told that racism in America was solved with the Voting Rights Acts in '64 and '65. Now I know otherwise. In celebrating Dr. King, I believe it's important to remember that he was hated, broadly hated, in his time. In his own words, again from that sermon at National Cathedral in 1968, he reflects on the vitriol he received for coming out against the war in Vietnam. He says, "It's no longer a choice, my friends, between violence and nonviolence. It's either nonviolence or non-existence. This is why I felt the need of raising my voice against that war and working where I can to arouse the conscience of our nation on it. I remember so well when I first took a stand against the war in Vietnam. The critics took me on, and they had their say in the most negative and sometimes vicious way. One day, a newsman came to me and said, 'Dr. King, don't you think you're going to have to stop now opposing the war and move more in line with the administration's policy? As I understand it, it has hurt the budget of your organization, and people who once respected you have lost respect for you. Don't you feel you really got to change your position?' I looked at him and I had to say, 'Sir, I'm sorry, you don't know me. I'm not a consensus leader. I do not determine what is right and wrong by looking at the budget of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I've not taken a sort of Gallup poll of the majority opinion. Ultimately, a genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus.' Martin Luther King's entire adult life, he was chiefly concerned with three major social evils in our world today: the evil of war, the evil of economic injustice, and the evil of racial injustice. In a prayer from 1949, when he was still in seminary and only 20 years old, he was assisting his father at Atlanta's Ebenezer Baptist Church. That day he prayed, 'Eternal God, out of whose mind this great cosmic universe we bless thee, help us to seek that which is high, noble, and good. Help us in the moment of difficult decision. Help us to work with renewed vigor for a warless world, a better distribution of wealth, and a brotherhood that transcends race or color.' Here we see King's concern for the elimination of racism, poverty, and war, and it was evident when he was only 20 years old. He said it more stridently and directly as the movement continued. At Riverside Church in 1967, he refers to the three social evils as the giant triplet sins: militarism, capitalism, and racism. He was consistently defiant, and he was consistently radical, but few celebrate that today. We celebrate nonviolence, we celebrate the Montgomery bus boycott, we celebrate I Have a Dream speech and the March on Washington in 1963. And of course, they are all wonderful and they should be celebrated. I tell you, I have heard the I Have a Dream speech countless times, and it should be getting old now, but it still gives me goosebumps up and down my spine every time I hear it. But they are only a small sliver of what King was about. It's important to state on this day to commemorate and celebrate him, to not acknowledge the fullness of his theological thought and the movement's goals, is to be inauthentic. We must value authenticity, real people and real lives. Michael Honey is a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and while doing research at the King Center in Atlanta in 1992, he discovered a file labeled King's Labor Speeches. It was a trove of King's speeches to labor unions and workers' rights coalitions, most of which had never been previously published. These speeches are what became All Labor Has Dignity, King's Speeches on Labor, and it was published by Beacon Press in January of 2011, edited by that professor, Michael Honey. The book shows Dr. King as a clear-eyed visionary who speaks prophetically about the host of issues facing our nation. King lambasts economic forces growing the gap between rich and poor, the massive tax resources used for war spending while domestic programs languished, and the knee-jerk demonizing of progressive social reforms as communist. He even criticizes the conservative senators, he calls them Neanderthals, who abused their filibuster privilege to block meaningful legislative change. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In an interview with The Atlantic, Michael Honey, the professor who edited it, the interviewer was shocked by the courage of King's speeches. In many speeches, King evokes the biblical parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Like the rich man, he says, America will go to hell if it turns its back on the poor. The interviewer, Joe Fassler, was amazed in our current political atmosphere, saying America is going to hell would be off limits to any mainstream figure. And Professor Michael Honey responds to him. He says, King had reached a point in his life where he felt it was more important to speak the truth, even if it condemned him to death. It wasn't acceptable for anyone to say what he was saying. You don't see very many civil rights leaders making linkages between racism and poverty and condemning the nation for what it was doing in moral terms and in a prophetic rhetorical style. I don't think you can find a scathing indictment of the United States in the rhetoric of any mainstream person at that time. But he wasn't speaking that way because it was acceptable. He was doing it because it was unacceptable, and he felt he had to speak the truth, and he felt his time was running out. Authenticity demands courage, and with courage comes consequences. On April 4th, 1968, King was assassinated. And I want to pause for a moment for our musical interlude, and then I'll continue. As we know, much of King's public ministry was advocating for voting rights. Voting rights has been in the news much of late in our country today, and the political calculus has changed in this country over the last decade or so. Once upon a time, protecting the right to vote was not divisive or partisan. Not long ago, there was a consensus in this country that voting should be easy and accessible, and everyone should be treated fairly in the process. Beginning with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, this consensus gave us 45 years of progress on voting rights. In 1982, there was amendments to the Voting Rights Act under President Ronald Reagan, which made the Voting Rights Act the strongest voting right protections we had ever seen. In 1993, there was the signing of the National Voter Registration Act, to the fifth reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 2006 under President George W. Bush, which passed the Senate 98-0. Since 2008 and the election of Barack Obama, states across the country have passed measures to make it harder for Americans, particularly African Americans, the elderly, students, and people with disabilities, to exercise their fundamental rights to cast the ballot. These measures include cuts to early voting, voter ID laws, and purges of voter rolls. This assault has accelerated in the past year. In 2021, legislatures introduced more than 400 voter suppression bills in 49 states. Dozens have already been passed, and many are in litigation. The Supreme Court has also gutted the Voting Rights Act a decade ago and continues to erode it and consider wealth a form of speech to further corrupt elections with dark money. In a functioning democracy, when a political party clearly falls out of favor, it adapts, it changes. It figures out a way to stay core to its principles and find out how it can broaden its appeal to a wider swath of the electorate. That is what political parties do when they lose elections. They don't create disinformation echo chambers, and they don't assault voting rights. The point today is that tomorrow, this nation is set aside to commemorate and celebrate the work and life of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. His consistent chief concerns his entire adult life was his struggle for the elimination of racism, poverty, and war. Racism remains deeply entrenched in the fabric of this country. Racism in King's time was stark and in your face and blatant in signs and laws. Today's, it is subtle but still insidious and very real and very systemic. In a recent census, it came out that a quarter of the population of our country lives in poverty or is in near poverty, 100 million people. The gap between rich and poor has not been this wide since the Gilded Age of the 1920s. And for war, in the past 20 years, we were in a perpetual war against terror. Spent 2 decades in foreign land wars in Asia, one of which, Afghanistan, was previously known as the graveyard of empires. Our annual military budget is larger than all the other militaries in the world combined. Given these realities on what Dr. King was most passionate about, what are we called to do? Our choices matter. What you choose to do with your life matters. We are tied in a single garment of destiny. So we can choose not despair, but choose hope, and choose the greater love. The songs we sing in UU congregations, some of the lyrics go, "If you cannot sing like angels, if you cannot speak before thousands, you can give from deep within you. You can change the world with your love." Or Spirit of life, come unto me, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. What can we do to choose as a community in 2022 to eliminate racism, poverty, and war? I know that many of you do work as individuals or philanthropic efforts to eliminate these evils that Dr. King spoke of. But what can we do as a community? Dr. King has written almost always, the creative, dedicated minority has made the world better. Not the creative, dedicated individual, but group. I offer these provocative questions as a beginning of of a congregation-wide conversation. King, in his sermon, Remaining Awake Through the Great Revolution, said, "We must realize that the time is always ripe to do right." And he would often paraphrase the 19th century Unitarian minister Theodore Parker when he would say, "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." In line with our Universalist ancestors, let us give them not hell, but hope. We can choose hope. I invite you to join in a moment of stillness and silence as I share a prayer by the UU minister, John Alou Johnstone. We shall overcome. When we can truly celebrate the diversity of contributions and talents offered by all people, we shall overcome hatred and prejudice and oppression. When we can truly extend our hands to one another in loving acceptance, we shall overcome the past and present that haunts us now. Living in peace and freedom, we shall overcome the wrongs that have happened and the debts left unpaid. Let us join together in that commitment to overcome. Let us say together, Amen. Now is the time for our offertory. This morning's offering will be received in gratitude to support the mission and vision of this congregation.
At this time, I invite anyone who is visiting for the first time, and if you are comfortable doing so, to please stand and tell us where you're from and how you heard about us. We would like to meet you.
I'm Brian Golden, and I'm from Farmington. And I've always known about this church and have come here on numerous occasions for purposes of historical telling of stories, especially some years back creating a house of worship tour, and this house of worship was on the tour.
Great, welcome. Someone else in the back?
I'm new here, but this is my second time. I just want to reintroduce myself. I was here in the summer. My name's Karen Day, and I live in Novi. And I was a Unitarian in Amherst, New York. It was a pretty big congregation. And that's it.
Welcome.
I was here in the summer, and everybody prayed for me. I don't know if anyone was here. I was having back surgery. It was like the week before I had surgery. All went well. Pain is almost gone, and I can actually walk.
Great. Great. Welcome.
My name is Heidi Comartin. This is my wife Erin and our son Everett. We live in Commerce, and we have always kind of struggled finding a home when it comes to community. And my wife found this location and was really interested in the social justice part. So we decided to come out and check it out.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. A perfect heart is one that has known love and loss, joy and sorrow. The perfect heart is one that has been shared. As joys and sorrows of our community are shared, please direct your energy, prayers, and meditations as a gift of compassion. Please join us, if you're willing and able, for our closing hymn, number 169, We Shall Overcome.
They have all come in different ships, but we're in the same boat now. May you go in peace.